I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm a bit of a fight scene junkie. The spectacle and the crazy balls-to-the-walls action have always been something that could very easily draw me in. The suspense and weight that a well-made fight can have is truly incredible. Not to mention, I'd be lying if I said well-executed choreography didn't consistently make my eyes light up like a college student returning home and discovering a fridge full of alcohol. If you get your hands on a well-shot, animated, and/or choreographed fight, it can be something you rewatch over and over again the same way you might listen to your favorite song. They're mesmerizing. But as much as I love the spectacle of fight scenes, I also love stories, and story comes first. Fight scenes become a problem when the self-contained spectacle and craziness is all that they bring to the table. When your fights don't advance the story at all, then no matter how suspenseful your fight is, the narrative is going to screech to a grinding halt, not be able to slow down in time, and plummet off a cliff into the depths of hell with the other damned. Maybe that's a bit hyperbolic, but still, I can think of a lot of really bad stories that have this problem, but for the sake of contrast, let's look at some bad fights trapped in good stories. The first major example that comes to mind is Daredevil. Daredevil's fights are shot nicely and has some awesome and well-performed choreography, but with a few exceptions, a lot of the fights in that show stop the flow of the narrative so that Matt and some asshole or group of assholes can duke it out. And as far as being fun to look at, these fights are great, but they don't usually have much beyond that. Let's pick a more concise example. Castlevania. Very minor spoilers ahead, but if you care, you can literally just go watch it on Netflix right now and come back. It's only got like 4 20-minute episodes. Alright, you done? Cool. So, in the climax of episode 4, Trevor Belmont faces off against Alucard. The lead up to the fight is great, with suspenseful dialogue, dragging the story closer to conflict with every second. And then the fight begins and they're fighting. They're fighting. And they're fighting. They're still fucking fighting. To be fair, there's a bit of characterization for Trevor and Alucard when he knees him in the groin, but that's it. Nothing about their relationship or the situation changes throughout this entire sequence, and while it looks great and I appreciate the hell out of it, that's all the good it does. Now, I won't say that American writers don't understand this, but I will say that in Japan, they've got it the fuck down. It's just something that's been ingrained into their culture to the point where it's become a recognizable style that people attribute to anime. Here in America, we see fights as an opportunity to show off, ramp up the intensity, and be really cool. But over there, they see them as all that and as a part of the narrative. It just shows in the way they're handled. You never see fights that are won without a reason, and the fights without purpose beyond spectacle in good anime and manga are few and far between. But in order to explain how they do this, we're going to need a specific example. So let's turn to one of my new favorite shows. My Hero Academia is chock full of fights that have a real impact on the narrative and also move the story forward. Its fights aren't just there to show off until the win conditions have their effect on the narrative, no, the whole fight is a part of the story. The best example of this is the fucking amazing Shoto vs Deku fight. Now, this fight is kind of cheating with its purpose in the narrative since it's taking place in a tournament, but what the fight actually accomplishes is brilliant. It's not just another round of the tournament, but it's also the catharsis of the emotional arcs for two characters who have been struggling towards their goals for the whole season so far. You see, young Deku here is trying to learn to control his extremely powerful superpower and do as his mentor says, which is to introduce himself to the world by winning the tournament. And since his mentor gifted him with this power in the first place, and a bunch of other reasons I don't have time to get into, Deku feels honor-bound to fulfill his request. However, Deku has also always had an instinct to help people and do the right thing. So when he sees his opponent, Shoto, who's trying to win the tournament without using his powers he got from his shitty father as a way to prove he doesn't need him, he can't stop himself from trying to help him and convince him that his powers are his and not his father's. This relationship between the two of them and their respective wants and emotions progresses throughout the fight, all culminating in a brilliant climax that resolves both respective arcs to an extent and pushes both characters in new directions. It didn't have to resolve their arcs though, it could have just as easily kept them going, but the important part is that throughout the fight, their narrative changed and progressed, so by the end of it the story is different. And it's not just because of the end result of the fight, but because of what happened during it as well. Think of it this way, if I were to walk away during the fight scene in your story and then go do something else only to come back just in time to see who won, would I be confused? Would I have missed out on anything regarding the story? If the answer is no, then it's highly likely that your fight is putting the brakes on your narrative, which is usually a bad thing for pacing and propulsion. And it's this simple concept that I see so many spectacular, awesome-looking fight scenes fall victim to. As much as I love that one famous dojo fight in Ip Man for being beautiful, well-performed, and incredibly intense, I can't help but notice that the whole sequence does nothing for the story. If I were to go in the next room and smoke drugs or do my homework or put my opinion on the internet or something equally useless for the entire fight, the only thing I would miss regarding the narrative is that the general is impressed with him, which I could have easily figured out from the conversation they have after the fight. No matter how orgasm-inducing Donnie Yen's choreography is, no matter how much this fight is a raw outcry of frustration, expressed entirely through fists that have no effect on the problem, leading into the protagonist's later struggles, the fight's lack of propulsion still has a bit of a negative effect on the overall narrative. To be fair, there isn't really any way to solve that problem and give the fight purpose in the story beyond the victor, since that's not how the story was written. But you don't necessarily need to have the fight deal with the overall emotional arcs of the characters or the plot. You can instead create the impression that the plot is moving forward by designing your fight as a sort of mini-narrative. Keeping up with our theme of anime doing this well, let's look at Edward vs. Greed from Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. This fight scene is gorgeous on a technical level, but unlike many fights, that's not all it offers. The fight begins when the hot-headed Edward charges Greed out of anger and desperation to save his brother, but he quickly finds that a straight-up brawl with the homunculus is not a good idea, considering he's literally invulnerable. After this information is revealed, Edward begins to lose, taking a bit of a beating. However, right when it seems Greed has him in a tight spot, he reveals that the time Greed spent toying with him has allowed him to cool off and think. From there, he's able to best Greed by breaking his ultimate shield with his knowledge of alchemy, but the fight isn't won yet as Greed points out Ed's condition. The punishment he took from charging him without a plan earlier has left him tired, wounded, and just out of reach of victory. I'll stop there, but does any of what I just described sound familiar to you? The cause and effect, the setup and payoff, the highs and lows trading back and forth, the pacing? Well, it better sound familiar, because that sounds exactly like a story to me. By engineering plot beats and storytelling processes into this fight, it keeps the story moving by imitating the propulsion of the actual overall narrative. And though not every storytelling technique applies to a narrative-based fight, the same goes for the actual scenes of your story. I've always considered each scene of a narrative as a mini-story, complete with setup, payoff, pacing, and of course, a climax. And it makes sense that this philosophy would apply to fights as well. After all, a fight scene is still a scene. That brings me to the only minor gripe that I have with the FMA fight. The climax of the fight, story-wise, doesn't really line up with the action on screen, as there's nothing quite as explosive to watch as that little opening section of choreography throughout the rest of the battle. But when you can do it My Hero Academia style and line up the intensity of both the narrative beats and the spectacle, that, my friend, is how fight scenes go down in history, and it's why the Deco vs. Shoto fight has gotten so much attention. Even with that nitpicky complaint about Greed vs. Edward, both of these fights have gotten a ton of attention for being gripping and incredibly memorable. And while this story-based approach to fights can sometimes work against them, making them too slow or dialogue-heavy, that only really happens if the fight is poorly executed. It's really incredible how easily many great anime blow past that problem of stopping the story with a fight scene. Ma vs. Koyama is another great one. Naruto vs. Sasuke. Fucking Pokemon follows these principles in its incredible Ash vs. Paul battle from Gen 4. Not to say anime is completely exempt from the problem, but it's crazy how many anime fight scenes are able to solve it. And then you compare all that to some of the amazing fight scenes we see over here in the West, and you end up feeling like this. And they're fighting, and they're fighting, and they're fighting. Oh? Nope, they're still fighting.